First, you may have noticed we have some guests here from the Brightwood Health Center, so maybe it would be useful. First, just I don't know how much you know about what this class is about, so I thought we'd take a few minutes just to talk about that and let you introduce yourselves, and then go into the course session today. So this is the Springfield studio, which Caesar McDowell has been teaching. I guess this is the third year? Third year, part of the Center for Reflective Community Practices, 10-year engagement with the North End community. And what we've tried to do with this class is tailor it to what are priorities for the local community and build the content around projects that the community is interested in. So this year we're focusing on an economic development plan for the North End neighborhood, working with the campus committee, which is a sort of coalition of variety of agencies, community groups in the community, and working with them on an economic development plan. And we've sort of taken the first part really to work on sort of evaluating options and trying to reach consensus with the campus committee on sort of what the agenda driving the economic development plan should be. And then the second half of the course will be more about developing recommendations around that plan. So that's a very quick overview. So maybe with that, and my name's Carl Seiden, by the way. I'm the co-instructor with Caesar.
And I'm Caesar McDowell. I just introduced myself to everyone. And the only thing I wanted to add to what Carl said about the course is we kind of have like 3 different modes of operating here. We have, sometimes when we have these sessions, they're really lecture discussions. Sometimes they're real work sessions where people are just out here with papers and numbers and pens and doing things. And then sometimes it's people out in the community. And today is one of those days where we're doing much more about kind of lecture and discussion, because folks were out in the community last week and they had some stuff to report back on, and we have some other things of our agenda that Carl will go over. But the other thing I wanted to say is that every year we try to have folks who've been doing the work that you're doing kind of come and sit in on our class, and we see this not as just the first opportunity. We see this as the first opportunity maybe to have connections with you as we go throughout the year, and hope to see you again, either here or out there, and want to pull on you as a resource as we kind of start to work through the efforts of this course. And with that, maybe we'll just all go around and say who we are.
I'm Annis Whitlow. I work for MIT OpenCourseWare, and I have been working with this class to get class materials and reports and content, so we can put it on the web, and you'll be able to access all the materials from this class in the spring when it's published online.
My name is Hania Baraka. I'm a second year master student.
My name is Meg Tuesday. I'm also a second year master student. I'm Amy Dewar, and I'm I'm Melanie Savi. I'm an intern at the Extended Medical Center.
I'm Tina Ferglow. I'm a third year resident at Day State Internal Medicine. I was here last year. We started on one course, and for this whole month, all of us are sort of at Brightwood for the entire month doing a lot of different work. So I think there's 2 other times that we're supposed to sort of either come out here and then we're supposed to participate when you guys actually come out to Brightwood. So I think this month we'll have a lot of them.
I'm Biranji Kaira, and I'm also a third year internal medicine resident.
Esther Lou, I'm a second year internal medicine resident.
I'm Yomi Akwebi. I'm a second internal medicine resident as well. And I think the theme for this month is supposed to be getting to know your community for us at the health center. So the idea for us coming here is just a lot of the problems we don't, the medical problems don't work so well, everything else isn't working well, so it's a chance for us to get a different perspective on things.
I'm Yuma Baisham, I'm a fellow here, and also I would love to have an advanced name to the resident because you speak so fast that I don't think I could catch half of the name.
Okay.
I'm teaching us about those. I'm John Light, second year master's.
I'm Anna, also second year.
I'm also second year.
I am Shubin Banerjee, I'm part of the Native Sorry. I'm Satyajit, I'm a Chibetler. Sorry.
Well, I thought we'd try and cover three things today. One is spend the first part of the class debriefing on the interviewing that was done last week, and any other pressing project issues that students may need to discuss. Then the second part, I'm going to try and talk through some of the analytical tools that may prove helpful as you better understand the economic opportunities and issues in the community. And I know there was a lot of reading for this class, and a lot of that was there, and not necessarily to have to read for today, but also to have as a resource for you, so you have some examples of different approaches to the analysis that you can use going forward. And then the third part is really looking at some of the reflection tools that the Center for Reflective Community Practice uses, and how you might be able to apply that to some of the work we're doing in the North End. Yeah. I mean, I sort of see this first phase as sort of consolidating what you've learned and sort of, proposing what you think the agenda for the economic development plan that you're going to work on is. Sort of trying to sort through these sort of four areas that we've divided up into, and sort of say either, we think the most pressing needs and the best opportunities around building a plan around Bay State, or building it around Main Street, or building it around workforce development, or some combination of those. I think it's really trying to sort of share what you've learned, what your assessment of the community and the broader opportunity environment is, to make some proposals about sort of what the sort of focus of the plan is going to be. So there's some consensus and support from the community about the direction you're going in. And you have an opportunity to sort of go forward working on a plan that you've discussed with them, and they understand what the focus and priorities are going to be. So I think that's really what we should be shooting for. And I agree. I think there needs to be a lot of dialogue about that. We'll have to see how much time you need to, somewhere between a half an hour and 45 minutes. I certainly wouldn't go longer than 45 minutes.
And the impression she is that, definitely propose like the big areas that we're focusing on, but then even like within that, I think they'd like to hear, like, if we're really going to focus on race-state relations, like what does that mean if we break out like 5 or 6 or however many recommendations that we're making, but that we're exploring.
And another thing that came up was, I guess it's not totally clear how much Nelsa speaks for everyone, but she really gave the impression that they're really expecting the focus of the plan to be around the campus. Now, I don't think that that's what we want to focus on, but I think that when we present it, we really have to keep that in mind as their frame of reference. That, the campus committee, like, their whole reason for being is the campus, and that's like, I wouldn't want to say that's all they think about, but it's high on their list of things that they think about. So when we talk about the plan, either we should be thinking about how could this relate to the campus, or like why does it not relate to the campus, but it's still important.
I'm going to make a suggestion on that front for you. The campus committee has set up a work group for the business plan, to work with this committee. And I would really suggest that before that meeting on the 20th, there's some communication that goes to that work group. And that work group has a responsibility of connecting the work to the campus. I think you shouldn't take that on. I think you should take on what you're focused on and work with the work group and tell them, you can say very clearly to them, in talking with people, you've seen that there's some, maybe some misunderstanding or uncertainty about how this connects to the goal of the campus committee, and let them carry that message for you. And it keeps you kind of on task and then not engaged in how the committee as a whole is thinking about this, because that's really their charge.
Yeah, I think it's probably also a good idea to in the update, maybe you could do a brief written update for the meeting for the phone conversation with Milta every week. I mean, not something elaborate, but, you know, maybe just a one-page outline of sort of where you are, what you're doing, and ask her to distribute that to the broader campus committee, so that you don't end up with Milta having one view of the work,
Right.
and it not, you know, sort of being shared by the campus committee. So I would try and get your thinking out to that whole committee as it evolves.
I have a question. When you, James, I guess as well, went up to Springfield, like the first time before we went there, did you describe the group that you were expecting coming in? What is their perception of us? Because I've heard very different things about what our training and departmental affiliation is. People have asked us if we work in a social service agency or we're in a social work school. There are others who think that we have sort of heavy design and engineering skills. So I think that we interested to know what exactly they know about us.
Well, clearly in our meeting, we laid out, you know, who we are, what we do, in a way that I think is consistent with what everybody else here thinks we're doing. What I think you're running into is an issue where there's not a lot of communication from that meeting to other people. And so people are mapping whatever previous notions they had, ideas about the class last year, any other intersection they may have had with MIT and then, or any university and what they're dealing with. And they're just kind of like mapping onto that.
Yeah. And I think it's, I mean, there were sort of, we've had 2 meetings with representatives of the client, but, you know, those meetings were far apart. There's all sorts of other stuff going on, so I'm not sure even the campus committee has prominent in their mind a really good understanding of what we're doing. But the basic, you know, the basic framework was, this is an economic development plan. We're gonna take the first half to look at some of the ideas the community has, some of the opportunities that we see in the community, propose an agenda, spend the second half of the semester developing that agenda. So that was the basic framework. So, but I think it does suggest that on October 20th that you might have to take the first part of the presentation to sort of refresh people's memory about what the project is, what your charge is, and not take that as a given.
I think it would also help describe what we consider our own strengths in that context. We're not real estate moguls for the most part.
Right, and yeah, and you know, you're 9 people with a limited amount of time, limited background, so that you do have to sort of manage expectations about what they're going to get out of the project. And I think that's a big part of that meeting, you know, building consensus about what the community, what you and the community see is what you're going to produce out of this class.
Just a second to what she said, the comments we just made. I mean, beyond just being like the campus community, being like the social focus, like she was talking about being like the physical focus of our economic development plan. So that if we're talking, I think we interpreted this right. That like we're talking about like developing this incubator space. We think about it emanating from the campus itself. And we're talking about, you know, instead of stalls or push carts, they would be like on the front lawn of the campus, things like that. Like just like she was describing that, you know, our plan should incorporate the physical space of the campus being the center of it. And that was,
well, it strikes me that in all the interviews, everyone has an institutional agenda that you are coming up against, you know, and I think you have to be sensitive, you have to be aware of that, but not necessarily let that lead you to your conclusions. You know, Bay State has a certain agenda, the city has a certain agenda, Austin Miller has his agenda. Everyone you're talking to has their own vantage point and agenda, and I think it's important for you not to be captured by that. I mean, to sort of understand how that might be valuable to what we're trying to achieve. But I think your client is not just the campus committee in the sort of physical sense of the campus committee. It's the campus committee as a vehicle to improve the economic development outcomes and capacity of the North End community. So I think you have to sort of separate out what might be an immediate agenda item for the campus committee versus what you see as the most, the most critical areas to sort of focus on. So I wouldn't necessarily take what Milta said as sort of, what should drive your recommendations at this point. I think, I mean, it's certainly something to be thinking about. It's certainly an important resource that you could draw upon, but I wouldn't necessarily have that shape your agenda at this point. I think it's a little early to sort of take that view as necessarily the primary view.
I think it should drive how we're explaining it, though, because I feel like if we come in there and don't address it at all, the first question is going to be, what about the campus? Why aren't you using the campus? And I think most of us don't want to really use the campus, but I think we really have to explain why. Why that's not the answer.
Actually, I disagree a little bit. I think the campus, they're absolutely right, the campus is a great resource. However, I think it's just incumbent on us to explain that there's only so much that any given resource can achieve. And so if they're expecting to come out of a certain level of poverty, maximum utilization of the campus as a physical resource is not going to achieve that. But it can be used in some of the ways that they've talked about, as a training space, as an incubator space. It's great to free up a lot of, and my impression is that actually more of that is happening than not. If not this underground strip, then the Peters School is being used by a lot of other agencies for a lot of the training programs. So they're doing it, and I think that we could build a case without being confrontational that more of the same is possible, but it's not a panacea.
Or, I mean, if you even have like a Main Street, I mean, I know you're talking about focusing on Main Street versus Bay State, but I think that if you did decide to focus on Main Street, you could actually include the outside of the campus in that, I think. Just not the inner part, but the outer part, because there's a big space there that can be used, I think.
Well, I think a big challenge on October 20th is how you sort of frame the issues for the campus committee. So, and I think that's, I think we're sort of ahead of ourselves there. I mean, that's going to be a big issue. I think there's still I think you're still sort of in the throes of researching the community and doing some sort of analysis to sort of uncover what you think of the critical opportunities. So I think we're going to come back to that next week as we begin to digest what you had and think about how to present it to the community. So how you decide to sort of frame the agenda for the community, and then that it might be framed around the resource, it might be framed around some other set of issues. You are probably going to come back and refer back to the campus and to other assets in the community, but I think I think we're still a little early to sort of know how we're going to end up framing this. I think you're still sort of investigating a little bit, but that how you sort of set this up and how you sort of help. And I think it's important to sort of see your role as not as potentially opening up the community's thinking about the issues and opportunities in the neighborhood, not only staying with what their thinking is now, but providing this an opportunity to get them to ask some questions they might not have asked, or to think about what are critical issues in a new way. So you might choose to frame it in a way that's different than how they're thinking about things now, or you might decide that we have to frame it in a way that connects with what their thinking is. But I think that's a discussion we're going to be having next week.
Yeah, and just two other points, because one related to this whole thing with the campus. I think in terms of how you handle it and how you handle people's conversation about it, really requires some understanding of what does it represent for the community and what that investment is. And I think there is a lot that the school and everything kind of really represents for the community that's beyond just kind of like, can we make use of this space? That it's really holding a whole set of emotions and a whole set of other things for folks in the community and for a number of the people who are part of the committee. So paying attention to that and trying to understand it that way can help you then kind of negotiate it. The other question I wanted to ask is what you, just real quickly, what's the next set of interviews you're doing? I just wanted to check in real quick. Because I think there still were some left off, and if you're doing those this week by phone or stuff. think there was Herbie and. Okay. But we don't have to go into them all. I just wanted to make sure that you were still moving on them for this week.
I think it's probably important to prioritize also.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you certainly want to get to the other campus committee members you haven't spoken to. That's certainly an important priority.
Yeah, and Herbie.
As well.
And
Herbie. Yeah.
I would be very interested to find out a little more about the community itself. How are they seeing this? Because they're the ones who's going to be directly involved on this whole process. They're the one, and if we can provide something that give them the capacity to continue to grow, that would be fantastic. Because it really hurts to think that the benefits are there and they can't use. Like the cans, they could use, this fishman, the bakery, and they were not ready to do that. How do they see? How can they grow? Getting them involved, we get a group, start to build a small group inside of the community. They can start to have some basic understanding of what's going on. It probably would be really beneficial. So I think meeting with Carlos and the other people who are involved in the community and help them to do that, it probably would be important. I don't know if you guys have.
Well, before we go,
Definitely
yeah, Carlos, and I don't want to go into the kind of discussion of that right yet because we do have some more particulars on that. But I think you're right that Carlos is one of those people for particularly that reason we need to interview. And
yeah, I mean, I'd say in terms of priorities, certainly getting to the campus community, if there are any sort of important stakeholders or segment of the community that you haven't engaged with, that you need to speak with, that's pretty important. It does strike me that there's probably some interviewing with workforce development, the education and training system that you probably need to, you've gotten sort of Bay State's perspective on it and some other perspectives, but I think you've got to get some people on the ground delivering training services, and then they probably have to talk to as well.
And there's one name that came up on this list that you handed out that I think would be important for you. We didn't have it before. This Bob Boldock, because you know what building they're talking about? Do you guys? It's the one that's right at the end of the community where the nightclub used to be. What's it called? What's the name of that club that used to be?
South Main Street?
No, it's not on Main Street. It's on the road that goes that goes to the bridge to West Springfield. It's just before you get to the bridge. And there's a no. Rascal. No, what's it called? There's a big building there. Rascals. Sorry. There's a big building there that used to be a club. That's all being torn down, and they're building a gas station, a store, and everything. And this is the guy who's doing it. And people from the Brightwood side are looking forward to that as a destination for shopping and stuff. So I think knowing something about that business and what impact it may have on other things is going to be very important. And I actually thought they were well along, but it sounds like there may be even some options to have some impact on that. So I think he might be an important person. So
we have Thursday set aside as a work session, so we'll be able to pick up on some of this. Also, I hope at the end of this class to give out some sort of analytical assignments to help support some of the work you're doing, sort of building on some of what we're going to talk about today. So you'll also have some other information to support some of your analysis as well as the interviews.
If it's possible, just have like 10 or 15 minutes in the class. That would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of content, but I don't have to go through it all in class. I could also post this on Stellar, and people would follow up with me if you want to use it, if you think some of these techniques are relevant. So what I wanted to do is sort of give a little bit of overview of some of the economic analysis tools that are used in economic development to help you think about to what extent these might be relevant and applicable to some of the planning work we're doing. And so the first phase of this analysis is sort of defining your study area. I think that's already been done for us. We know what the geography of the North End is. But often in understanding, geography, it's important to have some basis of comparison. So it might be useful to think about, a little bit, do we want to understand North End in the context of the city of Springfield? Is that most important to us? Do we want to understand it in the context of the Springfield metropolitan area? Is that more important to us in terms of better understanding the economy and economic relationships? So it might be useful to think a little bit about, whether we care more about the relationship of the North End to Springfield overall, to the broader region, or perhaps both. I've sort of put together this laundry list of some of the analytical approaches, demographic analysis, really understanding the population in the neighborhood, understanding the economy, which I've sort of broken down into these two approaches, economic performance analysis, how well is the economy serving residents in the community, how well are they benefiting from it, and that's more oriented towards the people as opposed to an economic structure analysis or economic base analysis, which is really kind of understanding what's the composition and the growth trends of the economy and what does that suggest about employment opportunities, business expansion opportunities. And then looking more specifically at retail market analysis, that's a more focused analysis that's really about understanding retail demand and supply for retail stores, and that may be particularly relevant here either if we do development along, oops, my microphone fell off. Either if we're doing development along Main Street, or if we want to think about retail business development among entrepreneurs or helping existing businesses grow. And then more broadly, real estate market analysis, not so much retail, but if you have a vacant property, you're trying to look at what are potential uses for it, how can you do some of that analysis. And then lastly, and this is in some ways I think one of the more important elements, is what I call resource-based analysis, really understanding the resources in the community and region and how well those are really serving your economic development agenda. So let me kind of walk through some of this fairly quickly. First, in terms of working with economic data, I don't know if you've already covered this in statistics, but it's an important point I want to make. We could just pass this out, and that's the distinction between household-based data and establishment-based data. Are people familiar with that distinction? I see people nodding your head, or some people not. Well, let me do this pretty quickly. Household-based data really gives you economic information by place of residence. And this is really primarily census data, but it tells you, what is the population and characteristics of the population, what is income, poverty rates, educational attainment, and the like. It's really a profile of the people and who live there. And that's pretty important for both retail market analysis and the economic performance analysis. The major source of data, especially once you get at a neighborhood level, is the census. Other sources like the current population survey, poverty estimates, local area unemployment statistics typically operate on a state, county, or city level. You can't really get neighborhood level data. So for the most part, we're going to be limited to census data in profiling the North End itself. Establishment-based data is about place of employment. It's data collected from employers, and it really relates to the employment, number of establishment, sales, and output of businesses. And that may have an impact on the residents, or it may not have an impact on the residents. You could have 100,000 jobs in a place, but that doesn't mean the residents living in that place actually are employed in those jobs. And so it's important to understand that distinction. The household-based data is really profiling the workforce from a labor market point of view, and the establishment-based data is really profiling the type of jobs available in that area. There are a number of data sources for establishment-based data, all of which have differences associated with them. Probably the most readable source of data is what's called the ES202 data series. That's from the Employment Uninsurance Fund. Employers have to report for unemployment insurance, so a lot of data gets collected there. One of the limitations of that data is it doesn't pick up self-employed people or informal enterprises. Current employment statistics don't really go beyond the state or metropolitan level, so they're less helpful for you. The economic census is produced every 5 years, so it's less current. But one of the nice advantages of the economic census is it actually gives you output data and sales data as opposed to just employment and wage data. Another important source is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has very detailed occupational data. And I think that's going to be important for workforce development work, which we can talk about here. I think the problem with all of the establishment-based data is there's almost no sub-city level data. Really, the only secondary data source that the government produces is County Business Patterns produces zip code-based data on establishments and employment by size class. So you could get zip code-based data. Most of the other sub-city establishment-based data that you find is private sector, you know, like Reference USA, Dun & Bradstreet, and you know, I'd say my experience with data is you can start with that data, but there's a lot of inaccuracy and a lot of incompleteness in that data. So I wouldn't take that as a given. If you're going to use that data, I would verify it locally, because there can often be a lot of errors. Certainly in Dun & Bradstreet data that I've worked with, there's a lot of errors. So anyway, the other, so I won't talk that much about demographic analysis. You know, I think we have some of this information already. It does strike me, though, that the employment status and obstacles to employment are a big issue in this neighborhood, and it's probably worth someone looking at at least what the census data provides to get that sort of picture. You know, what is, and there's a fair amount of data at the census, both in terms of labor force participation, but you also can get employment by industry and employment by occupation. So you could get some background, and you could even get a breakdown of, now with the summary tape 4 data, you get a breakdown of that by race and ethnicity. So I think that's going to be an important issue to look at, probably important to do some of that analysis sooner rather than later. Might also be important to look at the extent of self-employment. That's reported on the census. It's probably not completely accurate for the neighborhood, but you know, you should have a sense of at least what people are formally reporting as their self-employment activity as well. So that's sort of the demographic analysis. Economic performance analysis here, you know, you're really trying to look at how well is the neighborhood, is the economy really performing for the residents that live in that area, and how well is the local community participating in and benefiting from what's happening at the city and regional economy level. And there are, you know, a number of measures that can get used for this, including, you know, is the area growing? Are people getting employment? What are their earnings level? What are their income and poverty rates? And also, you know, how are they benefiting in terms of new economic activity, from births, from deaths, new development, and new investment. I don't think we probably need to spend a lot of time on this issue. I think the sort of economic conditions in the neighborhood, you know, are fairly well established. I think, and there probably aren't going to be a lot of secondary data sources to sort of inform recent economic activity. I think you'll probably capture more of that, you know, from the interview level activity about, you know, what sort of neighborhood economic activity is going on and how well that's connecting with or not connecting with regional economic trends. I mean, if we were doing a city plan or a regional plan, we'd probably spend a lot more time on these issues and understanding variations in economic performance among different geographic areas and different demographic groups. So the last piece of sort of the sort of economic analysis that usually is a starting point for a lot of economic development plans is sort of the economic structure analysis. And here, really, the purpose is to understand, you know, what is the nature of the local economy? What are the major industries? What are the trends in those industries? And how does that affect sort of economic development opportunities? It's important here, usually to understand the composition of employment, but also the composition of wages. In other words, certain industries have more impact on a region in terms of income generation than they do for employment. For example, if you look at the Boston metropolitan region, if you look at the high-tech sector, it's about, I don't know, 12% of employment, but about 25% of wage income. One useful tool to do is not simply to just look at composition by employment, but look at composition by wages and sort of get a sense of which industries are most significant in income generation. Also, in terms of trends, which industries are growing, which industries are declining. I mean, we obviously care what are the major sources of employment, but for example, we know manufacturing is still a big source of employment in the region, but it's a significant declining industry, and that might affect how we want to invest in it in terms of job opportunities. And then also having a sense of the occupational composition of the largest industries and the growing industries. What are the nature of jobs? What are the skill requirements of those jobs? And I'm going to talk more about that as we get into looking at the labor market. But also trying to understand what might be important industry compositions, industry clusters, and inter-industry relationships or supply chain relationships. Some of that you can uncover through the economic data itself, because some economic relationships, are more apparent from the economic data. If you have a aerospace industry and you have a metalworking industry, chances are the metalworking industry is producing metal parts for the aerospace industry. But some of these relationships will also get uncovered by talking to firms themselves and talking to economic development professionals who work with firms. In the north end, I think we have a good sense of the industries. The one sort of gap I sort of sense that we have a lot of regional economic data. We have a sort of sense of what's happening in the neighborhood. It might be useful to look a little at the city of Springfield. Is there something about the economy of Springfield that's worth understanding and will help us better understand the North End's role in the overall city economy? That's the one gap in some of the economic data that might be worth addressing. So in doing this, I think I passed out the NAICS. This is sort of an outline of the North American Industry Classification System, and this is really how economic data is organized and presented. So when you go to the establishment-based data and sort of collect information, it's going to be organized by this this sort of representation or classification system of the economy. And one of the problems you face is we've shifted from a classification system that was used pre-1997 to one that's post-1997. So that's probably not a big issue for us now, but if you were doing long-term historic analysis, you have this discontinuity in the classification of economic data. That's a problem. But if you're looking back to the late 90s through now, all of the data will be in the NAICS classification system. And as you can see, this is sort of a hierarchical system where you start with very broad sectors, typically denoted by 2 digits, and then within each sector you get more and more detail in terms of the industry representation. So if you look, for example, let's take a sector we're interested in. If you flip to the last page and look at Sector 62, that's healthcare and social assistance. You see the next level of detail is Sector 621, which is ambulatory healthcare services. And actually, if you look within the classification system, this gets broken down into even more detail. There's doctor's offices, dentist offices, et cetera. So this is sort of the way the system's broken up. The smaller the geographic area, typically the less disaggregated data will be available because you get into confidentiality issues in the release of data. So you probably below at the city level, you may not get data below, let's say, a 3 or 4 digit NAICS code, as where at the state level or national level you could get much more detail. So it's useful to be familiar with this and be able to work with it as you're working with the economic data. In doing the economic structure analysis, I think it's useful to sort of approach this a little bit strategically, because you often find you have an enormous amount of data. And where do I want to focus my effort in sort of understanding the economic structure? So I typically do when I do this is sort of start at a broad level, sort of look at the broad sectoral composition of the area I'm interested in, and compare that to, the other areas. What's sort of different about Springfield versus the Springfield region on the state? Does it have a much larger healthcare sector? Does it have a much larger manufacturing sector? And sort of try and identify the most important sectors to understand in more detail. That's sort of a starting point. You're not going to spend a lot of time, you may not want to spend a lot of time looking at transportation or utilities if it's not important in that economy, and spend more time looking at other sectors. So once you've sort of identified the largest sectors or the most important in terms of job growth or job decline, you're then going to look at the cross-sectional composition of those sectors by industry, dig down to the 2-digit and 3-digit classifications to really understand that. Is the healthcare sector in Springfield dominated by hospitals, or is it dominated by nursing homes? That could have very different implications in terms of employment development, income generation, et cetera. And then, look at how that industry mix varies with the region, and look at the relative wages of some of the industries, or some industries higher wage versus lower wage. If you have more time and resources, you would dig even deeper into this. You might analyze the 3-digit industries in more detail. You might calculate location quotients. Are people familiar with what a location quotient is? No, okay. Well, basically, a location quotient is a ratio of the share of employment in an industry for that particular area, let's say Springfield, versus the share of employment in a reference area, usually the nation. So, for example, if hospitals are 10% of employment in Springfield versus 5% of national employment, you'd have a 2-to-1 ratio, or a location quotient of 2. And it's really a measure of relative concentration. It's usually done for employment, but you could do it for other factors like output, for example, which in some ways might be a better indicator of sort of overall economic activity. And it sort of gives you a sense of where there are stronger industry concentrations. In sort of economic base analysis, it's often used to distinguish between what's considered an export industry versus a non-export industry. But if anyone got through the Fall River study and you looked at the location quotients, you saw for apparel, location quotients of like 60, right? The employment concentration of employment in that industry in Fall River, 60 times the national average. So clearly, that's a very, very significant concentration, very important industry in that area. And it also might help you understand inter-industry relationships. If you see very high location quotients in a set of industries, chances are there are supplier relationships among them, especially on the order of things like 20, 30, 40. Those are very, very high location quotients. And then you might do more research on most important issues, not so much secondary research, but primary research, through talking to firms, through talking to economic development organizations, lenders, training agencies, to really understand what are key trends in those industries, what seem to be important to the competitive advantages of the industries in that region. Are there specialized needs? Are there training needs? Are there financing needs? Because often what your economic development interventions are about is how to address needs of industries, most important industries in your area, to improve their competitiveness to grow and succeed, and to try and link the benefits associated with those industries to firms and residents in your area. So understanding sort of specialized needs, like this example of Bay State, if they have employment needs that are not being met, well, that's important to Bay State's success. But also that's an opportunity for residents in the North End. If we could create better services to link residents with those jobs, there should be a positive sum game both for Bay State and for local residents. And doing the structure analysis becomes important, for a number of sort of strategic approaches, which industries to try and retain and support, what are the emerging or faster growing industries, what's going on structurally. Is the city or the region undergoing some significant structural changes that might have longer term implications for workforce training, for financing, for technology services and other services. And the greater Springfield area has certainly been going through that structural change, still going through that structural change from a manufacturing-based economy to a service-based economy. And I think they're still working through those issues on a number of levels. And then really understanding the city and neighborhood's role in the regional economy and how you might want to change that over time. So before I go on to talk about the retail and real estate market analysis, any sort of questions, observations about the sort of economic analysis and how and if it might apply to the work we're doing in Springfield? Okay, well, we have John.
Just a quick problem with the census of 2005 already. And
Right.
The census
Yep.
so
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, I think one thing, that's a very good point. And I think one thing to sort of might be useful in some of your interviewing, to ask people what changes they've observed in the neighborhood. And that might help you gauge, what you're learning from the census data versus what people are seeing in the ground. So if people, I know one thing that's certainly already come up is there seems to be new waves of immigration. So the population's becoming more diverse, ethnically in terms of country of origin. So we know that's one trend. But it might be important to sort of identify some of those other trends. Has there been out-migration of residents from the neighborhood? Has there been a lot of, do people perceive stability? Has there been new housing development? Or maybe what we've seen more of housing abandonment that might be changing the population. So I think it's important to do some of that on-the-ground interviewing to gauge and interpret some of the stuff you're having for the census. One thing you do have that Springfield benefits from is the Census Bureau has created the American Community Survey, which updates demographic information between the census. And so there's a 2003 information for Springfield overall. It's not the North End, but you might want to take a look at the changes, some of the changes between 2000 and 2003 to see if they might suggest anything that might inform your understanding in the North End. But and the retail analysis will also get into some of that stuff. You may have to adjust as well. Income, you have the census data is 1999 income. You may want to make some adjustment in that income to reflect, wage growth or income growth, so that at least when we're doing the market analysis, you're not using data that might be a little outdated. Yeah, good point. Yes, sir.
Something that I'm thinking about is that it seems that what you choose as your comparator cases have a big effect on how an analysis, an economic analysis comes out. And I wonder if you would like to expound at all on how you would go about thinking of comparisons.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important certainly to compare to the metropolitan area. I mean, we sort of talked about in the earlier class, economic units really operate at a metropolitan level. So I think it's certainly important to understand Springfield in the context of the greater Springfield region. you know, because sometimes, for example, manufacturing decline within the city might be accompanied by manufacturing growth in the suburbs, and that's a different story than if there's manufacturing decline in the city and manufacturing decline, you know, in the suburbs. Just to pick one example. You know, once you get beyond that, I think it's one interesting question to ask is how does the community and how do political leaders in your area perceive as their frame of reference for comparison? So, for example, if people in Springfield compare themselves to Hartford or see themselves competing with Hartford, it might be important to compare Springfield to Hartford. If they're more interested in how Springfield's doing versus Holyoke, you know, you might be more important to compare Springfield to Holyoke. So sometimes that sort of, you know, local frame of reference can be very important because it's how people are thinking. For example, in Lawrence, people in Lawrence are always comparing themselves to Lowell. It's sort of one of these sort of comparisons, and that could be a good thing and a bad thing sometimes. But it might be important to sort of understand, you know, that because it is so central to people's sort of frame of reference. You know, that's another factor to take into account. You know, also, I mean, if there are certain areas that are important for certain type of uses. I mean, for example, if you're interested in Main Street in the North End and you're really interested in retail development, well, you'd probably want to find out what are the major retail centers outside of the North End, so that you might, if you're looking at the retail industry, you might end up comparing Springfield a lot more to Holyoke because there's so much retail activity in Holyoke, and you might, you know, compare it to other places. So, you know, you can vary that frame of reference for particular industries too. Okay. Well, let's talk a little about retail and real estate market analysis. And there are a number of purposes with this. One, often this is done in the context of development at specific sites. So, and you know, I think both of the sample reports I gave you to read were site-oriented market analysis. We have a vacant building. We want to reuse it. We want to understand what the market is for it, and it's very helpful in that respect. But it might also be done in a broader community context, you know, like a commercial district or like a city that's really trying to target businesses to attract. You know, what might make sense to attract along the North End, given the nature of the market, the retail market there. I think this is another important point. It could be very helpful to existing businesses to better understand their market, especially on the retail level. If businesses are oriented towards one demographic group, but they don't understand the rest of the consumer market out there, they could be missing some important market opportunities. Or if they really don't understand how people are spending money, and that might affect how they merchandise. You know, you might have a grocery store, and it might be important to realize that people are increasingly spending more and more of their food money eating not at home, but eating, you know, outside of the home. And therefore, a grocery store might decide, there's an important part of the market I'm missing. Maybe I should set up a sandwich, you know, or a catering business or something that could help me tap into this growing market for eating away from home, et cetera. So the market analysis can also be very helpful in helping existing businesses rethink their business strategy and do better. So the analysis really has sort of four parts, you know, a sort of demand side analysis, supply side analysis, then really trying to fine-tune your analysis. If there are special conditions, that's sort of the standard analysis doesn't encounter. Special opportunities you might want to cover, special market segments you want to understand in more detail. And then you've got to integrate that analysis to draw conclusions. What are markets we want to target for our particular business or project or community? What might be a feasible development type? What is the level of unmet demand? And really, I think what you're looking for is what are market gaps that you can fill or market opportunities that you really want to build on, and really trying to use this analysis to better understand that. And the one last point to make in just this introduction is to realize that what drives demand is different for different types of development types. So retail development is really driven by customer spending. So the demand analysis is really looking at local income and spending for different types of goods and services represented by that income. When you're looking at office development or industrial development, it's really driven by firm growth and employment growth. That's really what generates the demand. So you're looking at employment information and economic growth information as opposed to consumer spending. Another way to think about this is sort of retail is household driven, the market for retail is household driven, and the market for other real estate uses is really establishment driven. So in looking at the retail market analysis, the sort of standard approach is you define the trade area or the market area for the site you're looking at or for the commercial district you're looking at. And while there are some sort of rigorous methods that try and define the market area, gravity models that look at density of population and distance between retail centers and the like. I think it is more art than science, and part of it is by looking at the nature of the district. For example, when you're looking at Main Street in the North End, it's much more convenience-oriented in the goods and services it provides. It probably has a smaller trade area, a mile to a mile and a half. If you look at the Ingleside Mall at Holyoke, that's a huge comparison shopping destination, may well have a 20 or 30 mile trade area because of the nature of the activity there. So you have to sort of look at the character of the retail activity and look at sort of competing retail centers. Often it's useful to talk to merchants themselves to get a sense of the geography that their customers are coming from, because that helps define the trade area as well. And some merchants, one thing that's sometimes helpful is now, merchants will have credit card data that can give you a zip code or a community distribution of some of their residents. So sometimes if they're willing to share that data, you can get a pretty good mapping of the trade area. So once you've defined the trade area, you have to look at what are the number of households in that area and generate total household income in that area. Number of households and average household income, or if you don't have that, total population and per capita income, you can get the total income in that area. And then by using data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, that's a survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does on an annual basis. They survey, households have a very detailed log where they record their expenditures and they produce data on spending, in enormous detail by different products. And you can get that data by the Bureau at the Bureau of Labor Statistics site, and it's cut in a lot of different ways, which can make it confusing in terms of what data do I want to use to estimate spending. It can be broken down by income group, it's broken down by age, it's broken down by ethnicity, and there are probably others. You could also get some cross tabulations like region by ethnicity and stuff like that. So you do have this sort of issue of which data to use. Do I want to understand my market? And I think part of it is sort of what do you think is most important in driving expenditures. If you're in a middle class community where incomes are very comparable, but there's a lot of racial diversity or a lot of difference in age, you might stick with data that varies more by age. Or by ethnicity. If you're in a mixed income community, there's a lot of income diversity, you're probably going to want to do it by income. I mean, you actually look at expenditure data, the variation by income is much larger than other types of variation. So if I was going to choose one metric through which to sort of create a more fine-tuned estimate of expenditures, I typically go with income, because if you look at people with less than 10,000 in income versus more than 70,000 in income, there are very large disparities in how they're spending their money, much more than disparities but by other characteristics. So then you could generate demand by different product categories, you do have another issue with this data. You sometimes have to try and convert that into spending by store type, because product categories don't necessarily align with store types. When you look at the consumer expenditure data, it talks about, for example, food purchases, food at home purchases. Well, if anyone, if you go to a supermarket, you know that food is only one aspect of what a supermarket sells, right? There's cleaning supplies, there's other household supplies. So you often have to adjust for store type. And then the other thing you're probably going to do is make some adjustment for what likely market share or capture rate you think the local area is going to get based on demand. No area gets 100% of the area's spending, so you're going to make some adjustments to demand based on competition, and then you'll divide that resulting expenditure by sales per square feet of typical stores to get supportable square footage. So, in other words, if you have $1 million of spending on eating out, and the average restaurant, generates sales of $200 per square foot, you divide the million by 200, and you would get 500,000 square feet of supportable restaurant space, right? That spending would support. And then that just gives you the demand side picture, but you have to factor in to the market analysis supply. So the first thing you want to do is identify what are the competing stores in an area, trade area, and then make some judgment about what are the competitive differences between your site or your community stores and the competing areas. For example, if your stores are bigger than the competing stores, you're going to capture a larger market share. If your stores are national brand names versus independent stores, chances are you're going to capture a larger market share. So if you have a larger concentration of restaurants, you're probably going to capture more restaurant spending. So you're going to make some judgments about the relative competitiveness of your location versus competing locations. And then you also want to look at what else is being planned or under development in the market area, because you might not have a supermarket right now, but if there's a supermarket under development, that's definitely going to influence the potential market. So based on this sort of analysis, you'll make an estimate of market share that your particular site or type of store can accomplish, and translate this dollar value into a dollar value, and then come up with a refined level of supportable square footage. So the Brockton supermarket example that you had sort of makes this a little more easier to follow, and I like to give out that study because it's very explicit in terms of how they sort of walk through the steps involved. But they defined a 1.5 mile primary market trade area. There were almost 18,000 households with almost $620 million worth of spending. They then translated this into supermarket spending at 11.5% of income. They took a percentage of grocery spending and a percentage of non-grocery spending that aggregated to 11.5%. They estimated an 80% capture rate and used a range of $350 to $500 per square foot of sales at supermarkets, and they came up with these households could support somewhere between 114 to 164,000 square feet of supermarket space. However, what they found was, on the fringes of the trade area, or in one case, one within the trade area, there were 5 existing grocery stores with more square footage than could be supported by the trade area. So basically, you're looking at inserting a 6th supermarket into this market area. If it's a major supermarket, it should capture roughly, somewhere around a sixth of the spending. So they estimated, 10 to 15% of market share. And I think probably they discounted it a little bit because a new supermarket entering a existing area is going to have to take customers away. They're probably going to do a little less than capture an equal volume. So what they found was if you, based on this market share, you can support somewhere between 11,000 to 24,000 square feet of supermarket space. The problem with this is no chain supermarket will build a store that small. They typically want stores of at least 35,000 square feet, and these days with the trends of superstores, they typically look for 50,000 square feet or more. So the conclusion, you weren't going to support a chain grocery store at the site. Perhaps you could support an independent store, but an independent store is going to capture less of the market. So they basically cut the market capture rate in half, and that could support a 11,000 square foot grocery store at that site. They then went back and asked, well, perhaps this is a community that has a higher minority and immigrant population. What if we get an independent store that caters more to that population? Perhaps we can support a larger store. And they did some estimate that showed you could potentially add another 2,000 to 3,000 square feet to the size of the store if you really cater to that market. So that's sort of an example of sort of walking through that sort of specific analysis for a specific type of store. In addition to doing this on a site level, you could do it at a community-wide level or district level through a technique that's sometimes called sales gap analysis. And basically what you do is you estimate demand across a range of store types and then look at existing spending within the trade area for those same store types. And you estimate a sales gap. And the notion is if you have an area where there's a large sales gap, in other words, we have a large excess of consumer demand over existing sales, there's an opportunity either to attract new stores or for expansion of existing stores. So the difficulty here is you need a good inventory of existing square footage of stores in your area. I mean, sometimes you can use economic census data if you happen to be doing this for the city of Springfield, for example. You can take the economic census data and you can get retail sales for that city. But on a sub-city area, you really can't get that data. So you really have to do an inventory and estimate the square footage and then use industry data, typically from the dollar and cents of shopping centers on square foot sales. And you can multiply that square footage times average sales, and you can get an estimate of actual sales in that area. This is sort of an example of the outcome of this. This was a sales gap analysis done for Brattleboro, Vermont. And you can see that some areas like furniture and home furnishings, there's a huge gap between demand and existing sales. But then you have others, like building materials, food and beverage, where there's a gap, but the spending capture rate is pretty high. I mean, it's unlikely you're ever going to get much higher than 80 or 85% of local spending because, people are going to do some purchasing, when they go on vacation, when they're traveling to and from work, they're going to go outside the area for all sorts of preferences. So, it's a capture rate of 70 or 80%. You've pretty much maxed out. But in other areas, where you have a rate of 30% or 20%, there's definitely significant room for expansion. This is a potential tool you could use in the North End, especially if you were interested in looking at attracting new businesses along Main Street and what could be supported. And also perhaps helping people understand new business opportunities. What might be fruitful areas to try and encourage people to develop businesses because there's unmet demand in the neighborhood. Right. The other thing I think is important to realize is that when you actually, this analysis sort of assumes stores operating in isolation with a sort of ability to build the store and attract customers to sort of respond to unmet demand. But in reality, sort of a lot of other factors influence the success of a business in a commercial district. And it's important to take this into account in making, you know, judgments about what are real market opportunities. One is that, you know, people typically don't go shopping just to go to one store. They're either doing convenience shopping where they do multiple stores on one trip, or they do comparison shopping where they're attracted to sort of agglomerations of stores. So understanding the sort of agglomerations within your neighborhood is important. If you have a lot of restaurants, you may actually have more, but you might be better served attracting more restaurants, even though that's counterintuitive, than, you know, adding furniture stores, because you're not a destination anyone thinks of for furniture stores. If there's a major area people already do their furniture shopping, might not work to create another furniture store. But if you're already a destination for restaurants, it might be easier to add restaurants. So, you know, sometimes, you know, building on an existing agglomeration, it works better than trying to fill gaps. Yes, Seth?
Just to make sure I'm following you right, is that provided that you've established that the capture rate shows room for increase?
Not always. I mean, for example, if you're a regional destination for shopping, your market area isn't local, right? I mean, a good example in the Springfield area is if you look at Northampton. Northampton has like over 100 restaurants. You know, if you probably compared restaurant spending to the city's, you know, restaurant demand, you probably will have a negative capture rate. You'll probably show sales in excess of local demand because it's attracting people from outside the city. So, you know, it's not necessarily the case. I think and that's where the distinction between sort of convenience versus sort of comparison shopping is important. You know, people typically don't go, you don't typically have a excess in grocery stores or, you know, hardware or something like that. You know, something that's a convenience item that people don't travel far to buy. But you might have an excess in something like restaurants or clothing or furniture, where people will go a longer distance and want to have choice in where they shop. So even if you don't have a sales gap, you might be able to build on an existing conglomeration. The other way the district may function, and the North End is a good example of this, you might have specific customer or demographic niches that really form the foundation for your commercial district. So, you know, there might be opportunities to grow your business by, you know, catering to regional shoppers within that demographic district. So the North End, you know, might become a Latino business destination that could expand by attracting people from Holyoke and West Springfield and Chicopee, as opposed to just serving the neighborhood. And that's certainly an idea people have been talking about. And that might create different types of opportunities. You know, consumer image and perception of the district affect its market. Once again, we've heard a lot about that in the North End, issues of public safety. Another big issue in urban communities is what is the land and building stock suggest about what type of tenants you actually can support, right? You saw in Brattleboro a big gap in furniture stores. Well, what do we know about furniture stores that might account for that? What? Right. I mean, furniture stores are large and you need a lot of space. In an older urban area, you tend to not have very large spaces available to support furniture stores. So even if you have a supply, you know, gap, you may not have the real estate to respond to that gap. And this is increasingly a challenge as trends in retailing have gone towards bigger and bigger stores, right? You know, a lot of retailers don't want 5,000 square feet. You know, they want 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 square feet. And a lot of chain retailers have very inflexible store formats and sites for store formats. You know, drugstores are notorious for this. They want a 10,000 square foot to 15,000 square box with a drive-through window. So it's sometimes very hard to get them to go into an urban area where they have to adjust their format. So that could be a constraint as well. And also, you know, the competition for retailing has gotten more complex. Not only, you know, do you face other competing commercial districts and malls, you now have to factor in mail order and internet and things like that in affecting the opportunity. So often this sort of secondary data analysis that I just sort of walked you through really gives you an incomplete picture, and you really have to do more analysis to really better understand the retail opportunities, and that usually means doing more assessment of more comparative analysis of your retail strengths and market niches of your commercial area versus competing commercial areas. Be able to understand the vacant land and building space that's available and how that fits store requirements. You know, doing business surveys to better understand businesses' customer base, you know, what businesses are willing to do in terms of investing and marketing their business, surveying customers to better understand how they perceive the neighborhood, why they shop there, when they shop there, where they're going for competing goods, what might attract them to the area, and doing focus group and interviews to really better understand how you might be able to change the behavior of property owners and business owners to take advantage of some of these market opportunities. One of the big challenges for, you know, urban commercial districts is that you have so many fragmented individuals. You know, property ownership is fragmented, merchants are fragmented, and they're competing against malls, you know, which have one property owner that's forcing businesses to stay open at the same time, to market together, that's engineering the mixture of stores to, you know, address understandings of how shoppers shop and what, you know, mixes of stores tend to be more successful in attracting shoppers. And you're trying to compete with that in a commercial district where you might have, you know, some restaurants that are only open for lunch and some that are only open for dinner and some that, you know, have different times and you know, some that do market and some that don't market. So it's a big challenge to try and get people to work together and coordinate what they're doing. Yeah, sure.
What kind of information or what kind of analysis gives us a sense of the quality and number of jobs?
Within the retail stores? Well, I mean, there are sort of a few sources. One is the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces an occupational matrix. It's on the national level by industry, and it goes down to pretty fine detail. So if you want to look at the distribution of occupations for, you know, drugstores, you can get that distribution. Now, you have to keep in mind that you're getting that for the entire drugstore industry, not a drugstore, you know. So you have to, you know, for example, that data will include lawyers working in corporate headquarters for CVS, you know, as well as sales clerks. So you have to, you know, somewhat adjust that data to reflect, you know, the fact that you might be looking at a store. The other data is to actually speak to the businesses themselves and understand, you know, what their staffing patterns are. But the BLS data is a good first cut because it gives you a sense of the type of jobs. It gives you a sense of the wage levels of the jobs and can give you a first cut at whether there might be some sort of career ladder within some of these businesses.
Is there no industry association level information on this?
Some industry associations produce studies or data around some of this, and some don't. You know, it really depends. You know, for example, the Food Marketing Association has done some work on urban supermarkets, and they have produced, you know, some reports that talk about successful community collaborations around urban supermarkets and some examples of job training programs and employment programs around that. You know, so sometimes trade associations are a source of data. And, you know, also some of the employment and training agencies may have done, or funders of employment and training agencies. For example, in Boston, there's been a lot of work among the foundations around career development, career literacy, job ladder development in certain industries. So if you were to go to the Boston Foundation, actually there are some very good studies around that, you know, in the healthcare field, for example, because they've been looking at those issues. So sometimes, you know, you can find that type of research. Just thinking, maybe what we should do is, let me just finish up the retail piece and then we can take a break. The other thing I think it's important in doing this type of retail analysis, and I've talked a little about it, is urban neighborhoods are very different than suburban rural environments for retailing. And I think you have to be a little more skeptical and use a little more of your own common sense to adjust some of the numbers you're seeing. Even if it's not scientific, I think it's better to use good judgment and information to make sort of informed assumptions that you could use to adjust some of your data. So, you know, one is we know there's a lot of undercounting of the population in urban areas. So you might want to adjust up your population count or your household count to reflect the fact that there's likely been an undercount. Also, as we talked about, you know, outdated information, you know, you might want to adjust for new housing development or other changes in the neighborhood. There also might be a lot of informal economic activity that's undercounting actual income. So you might want to, you know, make some adjustment to income based upon some knowledge or estimates of informal activity. There also may be a lot of remittances. If it's a community with a lot of recent immigrants, there might be a lot of money flowing back to the country of origin. And you might want to make some adjustment to income for remittances because that's not really available for consumption locally. The other part is on the supply side, there may be a lot of spending on informal enterprises that, you know, discount the actual market. So, you know, if you know there's a lot of people doing cutting hair in their home or repairing cars, you know, in the backyard, you might want to factor in not only the formal enterprises but some of the informal enterprises in estimating markets there. The other thing is as we've already talked about, there's often a lot of market expansion opportunities in urban areas beyond just the local residential population. So, and that might be, you know, a demographic or niche focus, but it also can be sort of a visitor component, and we're talking a lot about that in terms of employees at Bay State, right? You know, we know there are thousands of employees coming into the neighborhood that are another potential market. There might be a lot of students in an area, near an area, that are a potential market. So it's important to kind of look at these sort of, quote, visitor markets and look at them as a potential source of demand. But also it's important to avoid double counting. You have to, there's an opportunity for a lot of error if you count students as both students and residents. So you want to be a little careful. That might not be as big an issue. I mean, one of the things you'd want to do if you're going to look at Bay State and estimate demand from Bay State employees, I would try and get an estimate from Bay State of how many of the employees actually live in the North End and sort of back out that number from the estimated demand. Let me stop there, and why don't we take a break. One of the things I'm going to do is James has begin to assemble some of the data for you, and I thought one of the assignments I would give out for one of the groups to work on is to do some of the sort of basic demand side analysis, supply side analysis to get a better understanding of the retail market in the neighborhood and try and apply this to the North End. Okay, well, why don't we take a 10-minute break and reconvene. So I'm going to skip over the sort of office real estate market analysis piece. I think you sort of read an example of that and I could post this on the Stellar site if people want to look more at that, because I wanted to have more time to sort of focus on this issue of community resource assessment, which is quite important to economic development planning work, because ultimately I think 90% or a large percent of what economic development is really about is improving the quality of local resources and better connecting them to economic opportunities and connecting them to firms and industries so that they better support the growth and competitiveness of those industries and better link the economic benefits of those industries to residents in the community. So it's in most economic development plans I've worked on, there's usually a fair amount of effort and work that goes into really assessing the local resources, looking at how well they're contributing currently to development goals, and figuring out ways to apply them more effectively. And generally guided in this work by a few pretty basic questions. You know, what are the important resources, especially the ones that are most important for what your economic development goals and agenda are? Are there, striking gaps, constraints, or weaknesses in those resources? How well are the resources being utilized, and by whom, and then what might be the obstacles to their utilization? I mean, it's striking just in the initial interviews that people have already done how much you've uncovered these type of issues already in the community, how much observation at least some of your interviewees have raised about resources that are in the community, either workforce or business development resources, and perceived lack of utilization of those resources. So we've, didn't take a lot of work to uncover that as an issue, and digging deeper about what might be the reasons why those aren't being well utilized. Is it language barriers, or is it that what's being offered really doesn't fit the need and respond to employers or residents? Also, a third issue, are there specialized resource needs for either key industries, special workforce needs, special financing needs, special technology needs on the demand side of the equation, or in the supply side, are there certain populations that have very specialized needs that are not getting well served? I mean, we've already talked a little about how there might be specific needs around child care and linking child care to education and training that might be important for North End residents. If that's a gap, it might be very important to address that. Spanish language skills as well, and services as well. And then, what's the agenda to improve existing resources, ensure they're better utilized, target them to economic development goals, and what are the specific actions to do that? So that's sort of a simple framework, easy to conceptualize, a lot difficult to sort of exercise in practice, because there's usually a lot of data that you need to get, almost all of it primary data collection. But ultimately, there are sort of 5 broad resource areas that you might potentially look at, one being land, facilities, and infrastructure, the sort of physical component to supporting economic development. Second is human capital and labor force resources, both the labor force itself, but how the education and training system as well. Capital resources, financing to support businesses, technology resources, and then organizational capacity and relationships for economic development. Typically that you can use that same sort of 4-part framework for this, but the sort of research focus, who you collect information from, is going to vary. And you normally don't have the resources to do all of this in depth. So you're going to have to set some priorities based on what your agenda is. In a downtown revitalization plan, you might spend more time on infrastructure and physical resources than we might. Given the issues we're facing in the North End, it's probably important to spend more time on the human capital side of the equation, than on some of the others. And also your understanding of the local economy is going to shift you in certain directions. I mean, we've already done that by the focus on Bay State and the healthcare sector. So I thought I'd talk a little about how to apply this research analysis approach to the human capital employment and training system, since that's a pretty important area that we're already working on. On the demand side, the critical issue, and let me pass this out from the Aspen Institute report. I think it's a sort of useful way to begin to think about this. On the demand side, we're really interested in, where are the job opportunities, what are the requirements for those jobs, how well do they fit the targeted populations we're trying to get employed. Are there specialized labor force needs and skill needs that are critical to the industry, or that they have trouble finding employees for? And then, what programs and services are employers using to hire and train workers, and how well do they perceive those as working? On the supply side, we really need to know what are the education, skills, quality, and cost of the local labor force, is the labor force, how well does the labor force match up with the demand side? Are there pretty significant mismatches between occupations and competencies that employers are looking for versus what the local labor force is supplying? And then, what are the experience and employment obstacles for people looking for work? Because often the perception of the labor market from the employer's perspective and the job seeker's perspective could be very different. And there are often a lot of inefficiencies and misinformation in the labor market. I was actually at a talk recently where a group working with hard-to-employ youth in Detroit interviewed youth in Detroit about what their knowledge was of health sector jobs. Trying to say, should high school students thinking about jobs in healthcare, what do they understand about it? And people's perception of healthcare is that basically it was doctors and nurses. Very high-skilled jobs, very difficult jobs to get trained for, and that were, they really didn't have an understanding of the range of jobs, and didn't have much understanding about what might be, occupations that might provide them a good wage that they might be able to get to through a high school diploma plus perhaps some vocational training, or even the notion of a career ladder within that industry. So often there's a lot of misinformation. In work I did in the greater Hartford region, where in the 1990s, where there was a skill shortage in manufacturing, you found a lot of young people in high school perceiving of manufacturing jobs as low-paying, very hard work and very unclean environments, and didn't necessarily realize that manufacturing plants were now a lot cleaner, that there were very high-paying machinist jobs. You could earn $60,000, $70,000 working in a manufacturing plant as a skilled machinist. So really understanding some of those obstacles, information obstacles and other obstacles, and then looking at how well the education and training system is functioning to sort of fill that link between supply and demand, and what are the gaps, issues, and problems in the system that we're going to try and address through some programs and interventions. So on the demand side, there's a fair amount of secondary data that provides you a first cut on this. You could look at major industries in the region, and then you could look at occupation within those industries through the Bureau of Labor Statistics occupational matrix, and then there are regional occupational surveys that will give you income levels in different occupations. So you can take some existing secondary data to provide an initial profile of both the type of jobs and occupations and what they pay. And you could also get some basic information about the requirements for those jobs. There's a occupational manual which kind of details the requirements for occupations. And now the Bureau of Labor Statistics has come up with this 11-point scale of educational attainment requirements or experience in educational attainment requirements for occupations. So you could at least get an initial cut of whether this occupation requires a advanced degree or a college degree plus work experience, or you know, a year of prior work experience, or et cetera. So there's a coding system that at least gives you some initial indication of what the skill levels are. But I think it's also important to be talking to major employers to get a sense of what their demand for labor is too, because they may have requirements that are different than standard occupational requirements. They may organize work differently. They may have higher or lower thresholds based on labor market conditions. They may have structured internal benefits and internal advancement opportunities, you know, differently than they exist generally within the industry. So pretty important to talk to employers. It's also important to understand how they hire, because often access to jobs is affected by how people are hired for jobs. You know, there's a lot of literature to support informal mechanisms for hiring, you know, employers referring people through other employers, and, you know, especially if you have residents that aren't already present in the industry, one of the biggest barriers to getting into that industry may just be they're outside of the sort of informal hiring network that's sort of used, and how can you begin to sort of insert a more formal hiring network into an informal hiring network. And one way to do that is when there are shortages of labor, that sort of opens up the traditional hiring mechanisms that employers have used and gives you an opportunity to insert an intermediary in that relationship between the community and the employer to link neighborhood to those jobs. Also, you know, what are employers' experience with that local labor force? It's sort of analogous to what we heard a little bit about Bay State's experience with small firms. You know, they tried to use local firms and there were some gaps. Are there perceived problems with the labor force? People not, you know, showing up for work late, having a high school diploma but not being able to actually read or do math at levels that they are expected to. You know, those sort of issues can often be an important part of what you have to address in terms of job access. So, and I think we're likely to find some of that. So talking to the employers and getting a robust sense of their needs and experience is important to the demand side analysis. And just a few examples. I thought I'd talk to economic development planning class a few years ago worked on a industrial park development at the municipal airport in Lawrence. And a hiring plan was a big part of that. And basically they defined industries in the region in terms of size, regional growth, and wage levels to identify target industries. They then identified some of the major employers in those industries through looking at directories of businesses and by talking to key informants in the region. And then they directly interviewed firms to really assess what type of labor demand they had, what their requirements are, what their wages were, and really identified an opportunity for some entry-level manufacturing jobs at relatively good wages in a few industries, and sort of built a lot of their plans around those firms and around employment placement and training linkages to them. The example from the Aspen Institute report talked really about a method that was much more driven by secondary data sources, once again using ES202 data to determine the location of employers in industry, using this occupational matrix to estimate openings, and then using the Directory of Occupational Titles to assess job requirements. On the supply side, once again, this is looking more carefully at the labor force in the area. First, looking at the demographics of the labor force. That might indicate potential employment obstacles if English language skills are a barrier, if having a lot of young kids are a barrier. What is their educational attainment? What is their work experience in other occupations and industries? That could be helpful in figuring out which industries they're equipped for. Gain understanding of what might be causes to unemployment. There are very high levels of unemployment and low labor force participation in the North End. I think it's going to be important to understand, why that is. What are the barriers among people? Is it a perception of poor jobs? Is it English language skills? Is it childcare skills? Is it transportation? What are the set of things that are keeping residents out of the labor force? And then what are employees' perceptions of opportunities? I've already talked about that. But also, what are non-traditional skills and experiences? Are there experiences that people have, businesses they've owned and managed, volunteer work, political experience, things that can translate into skills that will make them more employable or prepare them for employment and training. This chart lays out some of the tools that you can look at in assessing the labor force. Census data we've already talked about. It might be interesting to look at whether through the work of NEON and some of the other agencies in the North End, what data, if ever, they have collected on employment histories of residents. Do they have any information? And is there any information through the school systems about testing of students and what that might suggest about English and math competencies that affect access to certain occupations. So there might be some secondary data within the education and social service system that can be useful. As well as we've talked about, informal key informant interviews. One of the things I think it might be worth thinking about is whether there's some benefit to doing some sort of survey of residents as part of developing an employment and or business development strategy, since you do have unique access to residents through the NEON outreach workers. It might be more feasible to do a survey than it might be in other classes. And it might be useful in both understanding, getting more information on prior work experience, barriers to employment, interest in starting businesses and the like, to do some sort of survey. The last piece is sort of looking at the employment and training system. And here, we've already begun to identify what are some of the key institutions and some of the providers. I think you want to take a fairly broad look at this. Obviously, the K through 12 education system and secondary education systems, but often there's a lot of other sources of job training. For example, there are often private vocational schools that people utilize. And there might be community-based organizations that are doing a lot of training as well. So I think it's important to be fairly comprehensive in what you look at. And also understanding how recent federal changes, there's been a lot of changes through the welfare reform system and through the Workforce Investment Act system, and understanding how that's affecting what people can do in terms of services. And then another thing I think that's important to look at is what are the relationship between training programs, because often this is a big issue, especially if you're trying to develop job ladders and you're trying to move people, from a situation where they might need ESL and basic education into a situation where they could then get, more occupational related skills. Do the training providers have relationships with each other that link those services? Do they have what are called articulation agreements so that completing courses in one program prepare you for program in another, and you could transfer credits and training through the system to end up with a higher certification or a higher degree. What are the relationship with employers? Are the training agencies developing their curriculum around the needs of employers? Do they have placement relationships with employers? Are they providing post-placement support so that when people get into those jobs, they have support to stay in those jobs? Those are all important. And are they connected to economic development activities so that when economic development organizations are helping firms expand or recruiting firms into the area, are they linking up with the employment and training system to hire local residents for those jobs, or is there a total mismatch, which is often the case? One of the things I would say in terms of information sources, we've already talked about secondary sources and interviews. I think it would be important to look at whether there are recent evaluation reports that have been done, or whether there have been policy development reports that have been done at the state or regional level. Often those can be very useful. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I was involved in an assessment of employment and training system in Boston for the Hyams Foundation a few years ago, and this was really to try and develop a funding strategy for them around workforce development. And these were some of the findings, and I wouldn't be surprised if you found some of the same type of issues in the greater Springfield area. While Boston has a very rich network of community-based employment and training agencies, what we found was they often were not well connected to other actors in the workforce development system. So you often had community colleges doing a lot of training in parallel with community-based organizations, and there wasn't a good linkage in ways for those services to get integrated. There was an undersupply of basic skills training. The demand for adult basic education, ESL, and job readiness training far exceeded what the system was supplying. And I think this has been pretty well established as a statewide problem. Some of the reports that Mass Inc. have done and others is there's a huge undersupply relative to the need for these services. A lack of case management services. Often what we found was people had multiple obstacles to employment. They needed to coordinate transportation, daycare, job training services. They might have had health care issues that also interfered with their ability to get to work, and there wasn't really someone who could help them navigate those different systems and package the services for them in a way that they weren't, falling out of the system. They might get a job, but because transportation fell through or housing fell through, they couldn't stay with the job, and no one was helping them coordinate those services. Lack of child care availability and quality of child care, too, was an issue. A lot of people didn't want to, put their children in child care because they didn't feel good quality child care was available. And then pretty weak connections between workforce development service providers and employers. It's still surprising how much workforce development activity gets done without really understanding the needs of employers or trying to link the graduates of training programs to employers. A lot of organizations just deal with the sort of supply side of the equation. So finding ways to better make those connections so the people who come out of the training programs get hired become pretty important. So that's a quick overview. We can talk more about how you might apply this in some of the work you're doing in class on Thursday, but I wanted to make sure Caesar had time to talk about some of the reflection tools. Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
We actually need to get going.
Okay.
Thank
Yeah.
you for letting us know.
Okay.
Right.
Do you need the?
It is now. I'm good. Hello. Jonathan, I think you said you wanted to have 10 minutes at the end of class? Yeah, we can make that happen. And we might just pick up on some more of this later on, either the other work session or other ways. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about a kind of another way of Sorry. Another way of kind of getting that information and data. And I particularly want to talk about something that we do in the center, because one of the things that we really try to focus on is what can we learn from people who are actually on the ground in communities kind of doing work. And what's difficult about that, and what are some tools and techniques that can actually help in that work. And I want to talk about one in particular that we've developed, something called a critical moments reflection process. So I'll give you a brief overview. I'll put a couple of other things up on the web that can help you kind of go through it. And then if you decide this technique really works for something you want to do with a particular group, then we can actually do some more kind of hands-on coaching about actually how you kind of go about doing it. But let me start out by saying little things about what this is based on and where it comes out of it. This actually comes out of our work in working with communities, particularly people who are doing what we normally call on-the-ground community development work. So these are folks who are running agencies or trying to provide some kind of service at the community level, who are from the community and who, like many of the characters you've already mentioned, Matt, Carlos, Milton, folks like that, are just like doing the work. But when you really try to talk to them about what they do, it gets kind of hard, because sometimes they don't actually really know what they know about the work that they're doing. And shade up, air conditioning, that would be helpful. And actually, can you put the screen up too while you're at it? I think I'm going to write on board. Thanks. So oftentimes, people who are in the midst of a set of work and really kind of are getting good at it or making by at it have a hard time articulating to other people kind of what they really know about that, because it's not easily accessible information. And it's interesting because it doesn't just happen to people, at the community level. When folks were first starting to deal with some of the early days of dealing with artificial intelligence and trying to figure out, can you really make machines think like people? One of the first areas that they tried to mimic to see if they could really test this idea that you could build a thinking machine was actually in the medical profession. And what they thought was, look, if you look at a regular doctor, a doctor kind of goes in and looks at a patient and has a whole set of procedures for diagnosing what's going on. And they can go through that whole procedure and go through someone and take them through a set of things and actually give you a diagnosis of what's wrong with you. And so in the early days of artificial intelligence, what they were doing was really trying to figure out, can we build a computer that can do that process? And the first steps they did in trying to figure that out was to kind of map the thinking of doctors who are really good at diagnosing certain kinds of diseases. And a funny thing happened as they went through it and tried to figure it out, is that the people who were really good at diagnosing certain kinds of diseases didn't know how they knew. Right? They couldn't say, well, and then I knew this because, but somehow they knew. There was another set of knowledge. And it became very difficult for people who were trying to figure out this work about, well, then how do you kind of get at what they know? And this whole thing about kind of people having knowledge on the ground, that's really important, we think is really true, and we've kind of developed some methods of getting at it based on a couple of assumptions. One is that a lot of what people know is actually built in narrative. And if you help them work with the story around the work that they do, you can actually get at some of that knowledge. And the other is that people who are really kind of engaged in a set of work won't really do that narrative work if they don't see it really tied to something they're trying to work on right now. So it's a real kind of a little dilemma, right? You're trying to get them to be clear about something they know, but they're always focused on what they want to do next. And so how do you create the space for both of those things to happen? When we were talking about doing this course, I thought it might be really helpful to talk about this methodology because there are a number of people in the North End who are doing things right now, businesses and stuff like that, who are doing it on the fly, who are doing it on the cheap, who have been around for a long time, who are well established, and not very much is really known about what they do and how they do it. And I think there's one set of data you can get from just doing a set of interviews with people. I think there's another set of data about what allows people to work in that community and survive and the real kind of details and nuance of their work that I think you can only get if you do something much more purposeful and reflective. So I'm going to just go for 5 minutes and tell you some of the elements of this work without going into the real details of it, and then I'll put some stuff up on the course site, and then would urge any of you who want to think about this as a methodology to either get hold of me. We have some other works you can look at to talk about how to do it. So methodology has several points, kind of like 7 steps to it. And the first is that you do everything that's what we call kind of setting a framing context for the work. A reflection work almost always happens in groups. So you work with a group of people at one point in time. So this might be something you would do with a set of small business owners or a set of residents. You're trying to understand how they go about job seeking. It could be any set of people, but it's always done with a set of people. And we can talk about the reasons around that. But in order to do it, you're really inviting people into a context. So the context may be, if we look at it, maybe doing a reflection session with a set of women who are trying to enter basically the labor market, we could say that that's really the context. We're really trying to understand job-seeking strategies and what it's been like for you to really go after jobs and kind of do that. But that kind of framing is really yours, right? And you kind of frame it up with that way, and you kind of put some time frame around it, and you'll see why the time is really important. So it could be like we're really trying to understand, you know, you'll say to each of these women, we're really trying to understand what it's been like for you for the last 3 years, and your efforts of going and working and trying to work. From that standpoint on, really, that context is kind of set aside, because what you really do next with people is you actually get people trying to name what we call questions in the work. And what we mean by that is we have people go through a process of naming what we call their own inquiry questions. And this is a question that goes something like this. So again, let's take the job seeking piece. The question may be something like, you say to people, name a question that if you knew the answer to, you believe it would help you toward this goal that you have around trying to get a job. Right? So it's a very interesting kind of question. It's about trying to get them to think about something they wish they had the answer to. And most of the work we do this is we do it around people who are actually in the midst of doing a kind of work. So it'll be interesting to think about how would you do this to really kind of work it in a different context. So for example, we just did a set of interviews with some folks in this community in Honduras. And the kind of, when we put that framing question out for them, it was really about them, what's a question that if you knew the answer to would really help you understand more about how you can improve the condition of education in your community? Because that's what they were working on. And they had questions that they really wanted to know. And it's always about questions that you yourself can act on. So it's not like a question like, why doesn't the federal government give us $100 billion more? Well, you know, that's a different kind of question, you know, but really more a question within the context of the sphere of influence where you feel you can do something. And then once people kind of name those questions, you actually have people talk about why they named that question. You get the group to rank those questions, and then you put them away. Because the next step is what we call this kind of naming of critical moments. And in that stage, what you have the group do is each person goes back to the framing context we talked about before. So again, if I use the thing about kind of job seeking among a set of women over a 3-year period, you would actually have people take that framing and you would say to them, what we want you to do is name, from your perspective, all the critical moments or incidents that happened to you related to this context. And for each one, people would say, well, this was the critical moment around that, and they have to name why and when it happened, right? And then we put up a timeline. We have everybody put their critical moments up on the timeline. And this works really well if people have been involved in the same work together, because what you're allowing people to do is look at perspective on something different. So if you had a set of people who were trying to run sets of businesses in the same area, and you had a question about what made it, what was really good about, a particular effort to maybe improve the neighborhood that they were involved in, then when you have people filling out this timeline, you're actually getting different perspectives on the same event from where people are really kind of sitting. So the critical moments thing is doing that. And then the second part of it is after everybody goes up and puts their stuff on a timeline, you end up with this big timeline with people saying, well, these are the events that I thought were important and why I thought they were important. You then go back to the questions that they raised, that they identified as the things that they think they need answers to. And they go back and they map critical moments and say, well, which of these things, if we understood them better, would really help us answer this question? So you're actually doing a mapping where you go through and they've listed 25 critical moments. They may select 3 that they think would really, if they understood them, that they would have some answer. It might help them answer the question that they had before. Again, the idea behind this is that in their practice, they already have a set of knowledge related to the questions they're trying to answer. They may not have all the answers to it, all the knowledge to it, but they actually do. But they just kind of haven't really uncovered it. And then you do the next piece of it is to say, well, if you really understand this particular critical moment, and for example, it may be that the critical moment was, if we took, well, a critical moment can be anything. If I took the case in the story in Honduras around the schools, one of the critical moments that someone named that the community ended up wanting to investigate was actually a meeting someone had where one of their development agencies said that, well, education isn't something that we work on in the development world. Now, it sounds like a throwaway thing, right? But for them, it was a critical moment. And then the next question becomes, well, then who needs to be part of a discussion to really understand what happened in that moment? And then you actually try to gather those people together and do the storytelling around it, to do the lessons around it, to really then try to inform the question that they're really trying to answer. And the thing about when you do this is people are doing 2 things. They're really letting you know a lot about what the nature is of their work or the work they've been engaged in, but they're also helping themselves kind of answer some question that they think is blocking them from doing something better in their work. So it's actually doing 2 things at the same time. And in doing it, by people naming these critical moments, you start to really elicit and get a clear idea of the kinds of opportunities and obstacles that people believe are in their work. Because what's really interesting is when you look at these critical moments, sometimes people, once they pay attention to them, they actually have some understanding of, well, what's real and what's not real. Because they may name something as critical and then really, and have been holding in their mind as critical, but then when they go back and pay attention to it, they say, well, actually, that really wasn't what happened. Really what happened was something else. I actually didn't file that piece of paper I was supposed to. It wasn't the state didn't give me a loan. They said I didn't file the piece of paper that would allow them to give me a loan. But sometimes in our ability, and people are just doing the work, the stories and how they tell the stories about what's going on gets really confused around kind of the facts. And you can use this as a technique to really kind of clear that out. So I went over things really fast.
Seems to be the theme for today.
But yeah, we both went over things really fast. But I think if folks are going to try to do something and think it would be helpful to bring a set of people together to really try to learn something either around kind of how the businesses work or job-seeking things, or even people inside of an organization like Bay State who are trying to reach out and why it's hard for them, or we could talk about this as a technique and how to adapt the technique as a way of getting at that. So,
are you using this technique in any other projects right now? Something that we can observe?
we are using it, actually. We're using it in a big project in Boston right now, and also in some work that we're doing in Central and South America. I'm sure you would love to go observe that.
Yeah, Boston stuff, I mean, is there anything that we could
There are actually going to be some open sessions that are going to be happening toward the end of October. So that actually may be a point where that could be. And we also have a lot of the stuff documented and filmed and some synopsis that also is another way to kind of look at it and understand it. Okay? So I left you some time.
Let me just also, I'm going to pass out, these are some, I call them assignments, but they're sort of suggested analytical tasks that might be helpful to you in your work, kind of applying some of the stuff. So let me pass this out, and maybe we could talk on Thursday about which, if any, people want to do and what information and data you would need to get that done.